Hey friends, how are you all? So today is going to be a very quick video, very informative and quick video on Scrum. So I'm going to explain Scrum in three simple steps. If you're going to attend interviews, if you're changing from waterfall to agile, if you're going to be starting on working in Scrum, this video will cover everything you need. Let's get into the first slide here. So who are all the beneficiaries here? The interview attendees, IT interview attendees, IT job seekers, and all that. Anyone looking to save time and learn quick. For those people, this video will be very helpful. Anyone looking to learn in a simplified way. So let's get into the first slide. So when we talk about Scrum, the first thing that I want to discuss is about iterations. So what are iterations? You can see in this diagram here, when we talk about iteration, it is first and foremost for Scrum, the iterations are very small. It could be 1 week, it could be 2 weeks, it could be 3 weeks, it could be 4 weeks. But the most important thing is that in one iteration, starting from planning to design to development, testing, deployment, review, and release. Everything is covered in one iteration. If you are following the waterfall methodology, the product that you bring to the market might be outdated because, as you might know, in waterfall, we don't have the concept of iterations. Because in waterfall, as I explained in my previous video, planning takes 2 weeks to 1 month. Then getting to the design stage, that takes another 2 weeks to 1 month. Then development starts, takes another 1 month at least because development always takes more time. Then there is the testing phase, that takes another 1 month. Then implementation or deployment to production environment, that takes another few weeks because implementation has to be implementation monitoring, make sure that the software is stable, everything. This entire thing in waterfall might take anywhere from 4 to 6 months. So what happens during that time? The market demand is changing rapidly, and new products, new competition, new ideas are coming into the market. As a result, any software that is developed in waterfall methodology is getting outdated by the time it is in the market. Iteration, which is the basic concept in Scrum framework. That is, when you talk about Scrum, the first thing that should come to your mind is iterations, and this picture should come into your mind. Iteration is one single iteration has all the different steps of software development, right? So, and here the last point here is everyone involved in waterfall methodology projects might get criticized. Why? Because the product that they're bringing into the market kind of becomes outdated because the time that they took for making the product, starting from idea conception, that is planning, all the way until implementation, almost takes at least 6 months by that time because technology is changing very fast nowadays, as everybody is aware. Scrum framework is coming under agile methodology. As soon as we talk about Scrum, the first thing that should come into your mind is iterations. And this picture should come into your mind right away. Then you're all set. By the time you're all set, you're way ahead of other people who have no idea what Scrum is. The second point here is Scrum solves this problem by introducing iterations. Within bracket, same process repeated over and over again. So this process is repeating in Scrum over and over again. It can be 1 week iteration, it can be a 2 week iteration, it can be 3 week iteration, it can be 4 week iteration. Maximum it can go to until 1 month. Usually the iteration doesn't go beyond that. And third point here is end of each iteration is potentially shippable software called increment. So end of this iteration is a potentially shippable software called increment. What is the meaning of shippable software? Means that it can be used by the user. That is what is meant by a shippable software. And what is it called in the concept of Scrum? It's called increment. So what is increment? Increment is a piece of working software that can be used by the end user. So that's the point that I mentioned here. And the fourth point is base features or minimum viable product or prioritized feature is worked on first before working on other less important features. So when we talk about Scrum, we know that it goes by iteration by iteration. Now, what will be in the first iteration? That will be the base feature, or it's also called the minimum viable product, MVP, or it's also the prioritized feature. Because let's say we are creating a website. We don't want to be discussing about fancy looks in the first iteration. What we want is the wireframe in the first iteration. What we want is the skeleton of the website in the first iteration. That is called the base feature. It's also called the minimum viable product. Another term is prioritized feature. Any of these three terms can be interchangeably used. But the main point is that when we're talking about Scrum, we talk about iteration. And what will be the first iteration? The first iteration will be the base feature. So in this slide, we are covering about disadvantage of waterfall, what is the definition of iteration, and what will be included in the first iteration. That is the first slide. Okay, let's get to the next one. The second point when we talk about Scrum is that Scrum artifacts. So what is an artifact? An artifact is something that is produced by humans as a result of following some strategy. That is the basic definition of artifact if you check the dictionary. So when we talk about Scrum artifact, using Scrum framework, what artifacts are produced by the developers and the QA and the PO and the Scrum Master or everybody? That's artifact here, right? So in Scrum, we have basically the artifacts are product backlog, sprint backlog, and increment. Okay, we have product backlog, sprint backlog, and increment. Product backlog is requirements split into user stories. Basically, product backlog is a fancy term for requirements. And these requirements are split into user stories. The product backlog is refined, prioritized, and groomed. So when we talk about product backlog, I just want to explain a little bit for people who are not very clear. So product backlog is basically requirements split up into smaller user stories. And also a product backlog is refined. What does it refined means? It is written in such a way that the development team, the quality professionals, everybody can understand. That is called refined. And prioritize, what does that mean? Like prioritization, we already talk about. So let's say the most important user story in the product backlog should come as the first one. The second important should go below that. The third important should go even below that. That's called prioritization. Who does this prioritization? The product owner does this prioritization. That is the product backlog. Okay. Second one is the sprint backlog. Sprint backlog is prioritized product backlog, which will be worked on during the current sprint. So sprint backlog is also a part of product backlog, but sprint backlog is the most prioritized product backlog, which will be worked on in the current sprint. So let's say we have a sprint starting tomorrow. Then the stories that is taken for that particular sprint that is starting tomorrow is called the sprint backlog. So sprint backlog is basically a subset of product backlog. Okay, and it is the most important subset of the product backlog. And also it is that subset which will be worked on in the upcoming sprint. If the sprint is starting tomorrow, the sprint backlog will be taken from whichever is the most important subset of the product backlog that will be taken for the next sprint is called sprint backlog. It's a subset of the product backlog which has the highest priority. So that's what sprint backlog is all about. Third point here is End of each iteration is a potentially shippable software called increment. This was already discussed previously. So end of each sprint or end of each iteration can be interchangeably used here, is a potentially shippable software called increment. It's done work. It's a done, capital done, right? Done work at the end of each sprint. Increment is inspectable work. Who inspect this? The stakeholders, the people who are paying for the software. They would inspect it at the end of every sprint. So it is an inspectable piece. It is a done piece. It is produced at the end of every iteration. That is called increment. So we spoke about product backlog. We spoke about sprint backlog. We spoke about increment. Let's get to the final slide here. The third one is Scrum ceremonies. Anyone is going to talk to you about Scrum, anyone is going to ask you in the interviews, if you want to explain or if you want to understand, you just need to know these three pillars of Scrum framework. The first one is about the iteration, concept of iteration. Second one is the artifacts. What are all the outcomes like product backlog, sprint backlog, and the increment. And the third one is the Scrum ceremonies. There are 4 ceremonies in Scrum. The first one is sprint planning. Okay, what is sprint planning? What work can be completed in the limited time frame called sprint? That is basically sprint planning is a discussion about what work can be completed in a limited time frame called sprint. Okay, so sprint planning is a meeting. It can be 1 hour, it can be 2 hours. It can be, it is always time bound. It is always time bound. So if the sprint is going to be 1 week or 2 weeks, the sprint planning can be 1 hour or 2 hours based on the requirement of the team. But it's always preset amount of time. You cannot use, you have to set the time so in everyone else's calendar so that they are aware how much time is being taken for the sprint planning. What do they discuss in the sprint planning? They are discussing about what work can be completed in this upcoming 2 weeks of sprint. That is a discussion in sprint planning. The team looks into the capacity. What is a capacity? Capacity is the maximum amount of time the team can allot towards the work. That is capacity, right? So if the team is taking any vacation or training or from other teams, that needs to be, because if one resource is taking 3 days vacation, obviously the capacity of the team is reduced, right? Then if someone is going for training, then again the capacity of the team is reduced. So during sprint planning, we look at the capacity of the team and also the velocity. Okay, what is velocity? Velocity is what was completed by the team before. In the history, like when we look at the history, how much work was the team able to complete in a sprint? That is called the velocity. So we look at the velocity, we look at the capacity, and come up with a plan for the sprint. So that's also in the sprint planning. So let's say if 2 resources are taking vacation, then we need to take into consideration what is the capacity, right? So that means if the capacity is less, then we have to reduce the velocity, because in the previous sprint, if there were 10 resources and no one had any vacation, then the capacity is full, and so the velocity will also be higher in terms of story points. But whereas if 2 resources are taking vacation, we need to reduce. If the capacity is reduced, then we need to reduce the velocity as well, right? And so we have to come up with a plan. All these things are discussed in detail in sprint planning. That is what sprint planning is all about, okay? Then that is one of the ceremonies in Scrum. Second one is daily Scrum. Daily Scrum, what is daily Scrum? Daily Scrum is every day there is a specific time box allotted for discussing. Team will discuss what was done yesterday, what will be done today, and if there are any impediments. So every team member gets a chance to quickly share what was done yesterday and what they are planning to work on today, and if there is anything blocking them. So what is the meaning of impediment? Impediment means that anything that slows you down is an impediment. Sometimes people confuse impediments with blockers because blockers are something that actually blocks you from working on something further. You're stuck. Whereas an impediment is something just like when you're driving, there is an impediment on the road, which means that you're not stuck. You could take an alternate route, but certainly you will have to slow down. You won't reach the destination at the same time as you planned initially, right? So that is why we need to be clear about meaning of impediment, because let's say you are managing a team, and when you're asking the team what are the impediments, then it is something that slows you down. What are the blockers is something that blocks you from working on the next step. So daily stand up, every team member gets a chance to say what was done yesterday, what will be done today, and if there is an impediment or blockers. Okay. The third Scrum ceremony is sprint review. In sprint review, the product owner explains what was accomplished for the sprint. If we just completed a sprint, the product owner has the responsibility of explaining to the stakeholders or to the people who paid for the software development what was accomplished in the sprint. That is sprint review. And the development team representative will demo it, because we know that there is an increment created and we know that increment is a working software. So it has to be demoed to the user or the stakeholder or the people who paid for the software, right? That's what sprint review is all about. And based on the feedback from the user, backlog is updated or new items are added. When we say the backlog here, we are talking about product backlog. So based on the feedback, now you demoed the software. Let's say they say that, okay, we want something else. We didn't expect this. Then we have to update the backlog, right? The product backlog has to be updated and new items are added or removed based on the discussion in the sprint review. Okay. And ends with this meeting ends with shared understanding between all parties involved. What does that mean? Because like when we talk about Scrum, the most important thing is the constant communication between the product owners, the team members, and the end users or the stakeholders. So during the sprint review, everybody has a shared understanding of what was actually developed, was it useful, and what needs to be done for the next sprint. That is so that's why this point is mentioned here, because when you talk about Scrum, you need to mention about sprint review. During sprint review, we get the actual real-time feedback from the customer, and based on that, everybody has a shared understanding of, are we going in the right direction? Are we going in the wrong direction? Do we need to change tracks? All this will be very clear during sprint review. The fourth ceremony here is sprint retrospective. Okay. So what is sprint retrospective? Focus on inspection and adaptation for the just completed sprint. So sprint retrospective is always conducted after the sprint. So let's say today the sprint is ending. The sprint retrospective will be tomorrow. And what are we focusing on? We are focusing on inspection and adaptation. What does that mean? We are inspecting ourselves. Did we do anything wrong? What went well? What didn't go well? Should we improve? What should be done differently? What should we continue to do the same? Because something really produces good results, so we have to continue to repeat that. What didn't go well? So all this has to be discussed in sprint retrospective, and we have to capture some action items if possible. What are action items? Action items are corrective items. It can be anything. Action item need not always be additional work. Action item can also be removing the work so that the team do productive work, right? For example, there are too many meetings. So when we have too many meetings, the action items will be to cut down on the meetings for the development team. So that is an action item, right? But what is the result of the action item is more time for the development team to work on the software. So That is the retrospective. Retrospective is discussing what went well, what didn't go well, what we can improve, and what can be done differently, and what are the action items. All these things will be covered in the sprint retrospective. So here in Scrum ceremonies, we have sprint planning, daily Scrum, sprint review, sprint retrospective. Keep that in mind. There is always 4 of them. Do not forget. And let's go back to the first slide to remind ourselves. When we talk about Scrum, what should come to your mind? First is iteration and the picture, right? Once that is clear, the next step is about the artifacts, because as humans who are developing the software, we need to produce some results. So what are the results? Product backlog, sprint backlog, and increment. What is increment? Increment is a working software that is developed from the sprint backlog for that particular sprint. Finally, when we talk about Scrum, what is the final step? Is the Scrum ceremonies. How many ceremonies are in Scrum? Just 4. What are all those? Sprint planning, daily Scrum, sprint review, sprint retrospective. Hope this is very clear to you. If you get confused in any step, just go back and watch this video once more. It will be very clear to you. And make sure you read through if you got confused. But hopefully this simplified all the confusion about Scrum for you. And let's get to the final slide here. Final slide is thank you slide. I want to create more simplified and easier to learn videos for you. If this helped you to learn in a simplified way, please do subscribe, because that gives me the motivation to create new contents. Okay. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you soon. Bye now.